something that Cedric Rainey and I have put together just to kind of inspire seeds of change as we go through a tumultuous time. And we're kind of at a flashpoint now that we've been witnessing, different behaviors and different tolerance levels within our country and within society as a whole, because it's really worldwide. But part of what we are trying to do is make sure that we give people the opportunity to come together in a digital community, understanding that our community is no longer bound by geographic location, right? Your community is who you surround yourself with physically and digitally, and it can spread to all over the world. So we want to give people the opportunity to come together as a community, share their thoughts, share their experiences, inspire each other to continue changing and continue leading, and hopefully give you guys some resources or some direction that you can reach into to help kind of fight the pandemic that we have, not of COVID, but the pandemic that we have of systemic racism. So Cedric, I'm gonna let you kind of get into some things and then we'll kick off.
Wonderful. Thank you everybody again for joining us. With us today, we have Dr. McPherson. She actually reached out to me after our last meeting and just kind of wanted to know how she can get involved. And it just so happened it worked out that one of the most challenging areas, I think, last time that we saw was parents. So the last session, we went through several different topics, but one of the topics that we noticed kind of generated the most questions was the one, basically parents talking about kids, education and kids. And so we wanted to use this forum to highlight that. So so Dr. McPherson, she is, a licensed doctor, and she has some materials for us. She's going to walk us through and kind of tell us a little bit about her experience first and why she became a doctor, and then talk about how we can walk through those conversations and what that's going to look like. We also have some materials to provide you. So we look forward to working through this, and thank you all again for joining.
Change, Cedric. So we're going to start with taking kind of a different approach where we've got Dr. McPherson on and we have Chanel on, and then Tangi and myself on kind of acting as panelists. And what we really want to do is kind of talk about the differences and approaches of how people have began to address this with their children. Because the overarching question or the overarching topic that we really want to dig into is how we address racial inequality and social injustice with our children, right? Our children are at ages up and down the ladder from 0 to 21, right? And beyond that, depending on how we parent them. And it's our duty to prepare them for the world, make sure that they're equipped educationally, make sure they're equipped socially, and then give them the guidance that they need. And so in a lot of cases, this is somewhat foreign territory to them, right? And so they need the direction. And the other element that we have to layer on top of this is they live in a digital social media age. So just like we want to use it to create community, there are things that are coming at them that we have to combat too. And so as parents, how do we prepare and prepare our children to address and combat not just social injustice and racial inequality, but the images that accompany those things and the content that accompany them that they may face in social media, they may face just when they're out in the world. So that's really what we want to look at. So for Tangi and myself, we're a set of Black parents raising 2 Black children. One is 19. She's pretty stable in her thinking and really doesn't have much concern regarding what's going on around us. You could say it's a blessing that she has special needs because she's self-contained in her mind. So having this conversation with our son was a lot different. We didn't have any practice having this conversation with the older child because we didn't have to. We do have to have the conversation with our son, who's now 11, who's just shy of the age that Tamir Rice was when he was killed, right? And the questions he has from a child's mind are pretty simple. Why are people so bad? Why are the police so bad? And the direct quote that he gave to us in conversation was, the police are making themselves look bad. We're supposed to trust them They're supposed to protect us, but all they're doing is killing people. And the America we live in, this is an 11-year-old kid, the America we live in talks about patriotism, but all they do is hate people. And another question he asked us was, why does God let us suffer? Right? Those are big questions that you have to answer, right? And so, we took a couple of approaches. We approached it from the spiritual angle. Tangi's a teacher. We approached it from an educational angle. And then I just had to talk to him about being a man, right? And being a Black man in America, which is a conversation that some people don't have to have with their children. And instructing him about the truth. And that was the way we handled it. We just told him the truth. And the truth is, all white people are not bad. All police officers are not bad. There are people who have historical and familial backgrounds that don't necessarily align to us in what we teach. And part of those backgrounds cause them to have a desire to control or oppress or lord over others. And they do that in some instances out of fear of losing that control, out of fear of what you may be capable of physically and mentally as a young Black man. And so because of that, you see these things taking place. You see people getting killed. You see people being wrongly convicted, wrongly arrested. We went through the whole litany of things with him. And we tried to address it at his level, but we tended not to shy away from the brutal truth. Now, one thing that we did not do, and this was intentional, was allow him to watch the video of George Floyd being killed. That was an intentional decision for us because he's been born into a series of activities that have taken place, right? He was born into Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and the list goes on. He's born, so he's seen it. So we want to protect the last little bit of innocence that he has. So we made a conscious decision not to show him in an attempt to try to slow down some of the trauma, but still talk to him to prepare him. I talked to him individually, we talked to him together, and Tangi talked to him individually as well from a mother's point of view. So Tangi, do you have anything that you want to share about the conversations that you had with him?
One thing I did is asked him, and I kind of went through as many races as I could, just kind of wanted to see what he thought. What do you think about this race? Just trying to get into his head. And it was disturbing because for every single race, he was like, oh, they're fine, they're good. But for white, because of what he's been seeing and hearing, he just said, some are good, but then some are bad. They want to hurt us, they want to kill us. And so that's hard to hear. And so I always try to bring in the spiritual part because we are Christians, and in order to be a Christian, you have to have the love of God and you have to teach that. And so I always try to bring that in and try to hope that he can understand that you have to sift the good from the bad and still try to love people as people. And then the other thing is just really just trying to digest the question of, because honestly, I have the question myself, is why did God allow us to suffer like this? I really had no answers for that, and I didn't know how to answer it. So
I think they cut out. Hold on. Yeah, I saw a little bit of fumbling in his computer, so they'll probably hop right back on. But what we'll do is let's give him a few minutes to hop back on. I think that she was making a great point, and I'd hate to chop it up with different people, so we'll just give them a few minutes and let them hop back on, if that's all right with them. All right, cool. Give me 1 second. Just make sure. All right, they said that they're rejoining right now, so just give them 1 second.
Of course, it would be the IT person, right?
Of course, it would be the IT person. So I guess while I have you guys' attention, what I can do is there are a couple documents that that Dr. McPherson has. So, oh, okay, he asked me. All right, so Chanel, I know. So one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to give a couple of perspectives, and so we have Chanel, who's friends with Ken and Tangi, and so we brought her on to kind of give us a different perspective. So Ken kind of gave us the perspective from a Black family with a Black child, and so Chanel, why don't you just kind of introduce yourselves, give us some of your background, and then kind of go into some of the struggles that you're dealing with and talking to your kids, and kind of the strategies that you've taken in
Yeah.
dealing with that, and just your perspective.
So I'm Chanel. I live in Dallas, Texas. I have a 14-year-old son who is biracial and multicultural on many levels. On his dad's side, his grandparents, his great-grandmother and his grandparents speak Spanish at home. So he has a lot of different backgrounds. And then I have a 15-month-old daughter who is white. And as I was, thank you so much for inviting me to this call. And as I was thinking about the topic, kind of, probably overthinked it, but I realized like no one ever, I don't think ever taught me how to deal with the fact that I was white. And so I think as a parent of a biracial child, when I was pregnant with my son, I read every book I could find, which there wasn't a lot as far as coming from a perspective of a white person raising a Black child. And, I didn't like it's weird, but I didn't like calling him a Black child. And because to me, he's just half me and he's half his dad and he's my son. So I didn't really like those labels. My ex-husband helped me kind of get through that. And he said something to me. It's not a fun thing to hear, but he was like, look, if your son robbed a bank, are they going to say a biracial child robbed the bank? No, they're not. They're going to say this Black man robbed a bank. So you really have to prepare him as much as you can as a mother to understand what it's like being a Black man in the United States. So I just talked to a lot of people. I read a lot of books, and it was a lot of just trying to be honest and speaking with him about subjects that I didn't, part of me felt like I don't know what that experience is like. So I felt a lot of the times just, I don't know if the word's unworthy, but I just felt like I was not the best person to give him that experience or to teach him about that experience. As the years have gone on, because of things that have happened in our lives, I feel like I understand that experience more because of what I've watched my son go through. So, I think I have a lot more wisdom now than I did as I began that parenting journey. And, now I have a daughter who is white, and, she has her brother. And I thought about it while I was pregnant. I was like, am I going to not teach her the same things I taught my son? Of course not, because I really think the things that he learned while he was still at home before he went to school that helped him so much aren't just, it's not an experience or knowledge that only Black children should hear. It's knowledge that every child, I think, should hear. And it may not apply to them on a daily basis, but as we become adults and hopefully your circle widens and your friends are diverse. I hope that for everybody, that they have if they can have a diverse set of friends. I think that's knowledge that's helpful for any child, for sure.
Absolutely. And Tangi, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and let you kind of finish your thought. I know that you had got kind of cut out. I don't know if you wanted to finish what you were saying. We thought it was very helpful, the conversation, but if not, then I can go ahead and kind of kick it to Dr. McPherson so she can talk about kind of, Dr. McPherson, based on what you've heard, and maybe kind of share your thoughts on what you heard, and then we can kind of get into some of the questions that we had brought for the forum. So Dr. McPherson.
Well, hold on, Cedric. It was my fault. I let the battery die. So we'll let Tangi finish up.
Oh, it's okay. I mean, I was just basically wrapping up. Just sometimes you don't have the answers. There are some parts of this that I don't know how to explain. So hopefully through this discussion, I can walk away with answers. All of us can walk away with some answers.
And Dr. McPherson, what I'll do is I'll go ahead, and she's actually put together like a conversation flow chart, if you will. So if you would look in your chat, I'll go ahead and upload that now so that everyone can see it and kind of download it and just look it over as we talk about it. So without further ado, Dr. McPherson.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, the time. The first thing that I wanted to respond to is I find it interesting how no matter how different we are, we all kind of experience the same problems in one way or another. So just listening to Ken and Tangi and Chanel, I too am the mother of 3 boys and 3 all Black boys. My husband is the father of 2 children who are also biracial. Their mother is white. So, we have some things going on, and just listening to the conversation, the tough conversations that have to be had, whether you can identify or not. So, like Tangi said, that tough question, we have a spiritual background as well of why does God allow us to go through these things, and just trying to explain to children that, no matter what our race or whatever the situation is, we have to learn, like she said, to show that love of God. Or like Chanel said, feeling like I'm a mom. Yes, I'm Black, but I'm a female. So I don't have those same experiences that my boys have had. And they've had quite a few experiences. And just to touch, like Cedric said, I got into the field of mental health because I do have 3 boys. They're 25, 22, and 14. And with my oldest son, he struggled in school. He has attention deficit. His father was murdered in our community right before he turned 4 years old. And, just having that, in addition to just being a little boy, right, that mind all over the place, it was just hard to keep him settled. So for me, it was, I got to go to school to figure out how to take care of my little boy, because otherwise he's going to be pushed out of the system or just pushed through the system. So as a Black child, I wanted him to have the opportunity. So that is literally how I ended up with a PhD. I just felt like that was my only option. But yes, those conversations are tough, and being able to just be as real as we can. I think in talking to families and children throughout the years, even my own, I think the biggest thing that we are afraid to be is ourselves, right? So when we go in trying to be professional or trying to know more than they do or trying to be comfortable with the situation, we make it worse, right? Because they're kids, they're so transparent. They're very forgiving. They don't care. But when we begin to block things or hide things, then they learn that too.
So Dr. McPherson, just kind of looking at your document, you outline a couple of good steps. And step 1 is accepting responsibility.
Right.
Where you have, I know we don't talk a lot, and I apologize for that. So that's one of the conversation starters. Can you walk through that first step that would lead a conversation?
Sure. So looking at that, like I said, accepting responsibility, it goes back to a lot of times, I'm talking about myself. We're not perfect. There's not a manual that can say, you know what, they're 2.5, so we've got to hit this topic, or they're 5 now. So life kind of just happens. And then you're like, we got to talk about that too, So sometimes we talk like we should, and sometimes we don't. So whatever we do, again, be very transparent. Going into these children, letting them know, you know what, you're only 5. We don't have a lot of conversation. I'm sorry about that. What goes on in the playground, So just accepting responsibility. Because again, I feel like children shut down when they think we're not being genuine. That's what causes them to shut down. So it's going to be very awkward for a child, no matter how old you are, how old they are. If we don't have conversation, this conversation is going to be super awkward, right? So I got to go in and say, even if he's 16, hey, son, you know what? I've messed up. There's a lot of things that we should have talked about along the way. But this made me realize how important conversation is. So let's talk about it. I gotta be real about that. And then if I'm that, a parent that does have that conversation, hey, I know we talk about things all the time, but this has got to be different. This conversation may be a little more uncomfortable, or, I know I have trouble talking about it with my friends at work. Whatever it is, share your experience at an age appropriate level. Just be very honest, accept that responsibility.
Hey, Dr. McPherson, and you mentioned kind of getting that conversation started when we had originally talked, and you were like, don't sit them down like it's a formal sit down. Can you just talk about the best ways to approach the initiating the conversation, like the setting and what's the right way to do that?
And so the first thing, and when we had our smaller meeting, the first thing that I mentioned was we definitely don't want to go in. So we came into this meeting because it's a meeting with an agenda. But when you have a conversation, you don't want to do that, whether it's a child or an adult, right? So you don't want to go in with an agenda, kind of like, okay, we have to talk about these racial issues, and we're white, so we got to say this, or we're black, so, and if they say this is hard, this is what I'm going to say back. You really have to kind of go in blindsided, because they're coming in blindsided. So it's fair. It's okay. We're just being human right now. It's a learning experience. But go in blindsided. That way, whatever they say, take time at that moment to think about it. And I will share with them, I have a 14-year-old, and I check in and have conversations. And he was with his dad a couple weekends ago when the protests first started. And so I kind of just text them, hey, you intelligent, smart black boy, how are you feeling about all of this? This is real obvious that it's a lot going on. And caught me by surprise. I was sharing with them, his response was, I want to be there. For me, protest was not on my agenda. I have to be honest. So when he said that, I was like, okay, you got to keep it's all right part, but, or let's not look like, oh, why? So, it's like, oh, okay, where and why? Where do you want to be? Why do you want to be there? And that took me back to what Chanel was sharing. His response caused me to think, we're not having this conversation from a black mother's standpoint. We're having this conversation from a 14-year-old black boy standpoint. So I had to immediately switch, like, okay, this is important to him. He's able to verbalize why. So I have to put my stuff aside, because a lot of times we go to church because that's what I want to do, right? So he's got to put his stuff aside and get in the car. So at that point, with that communication, I said, you know what? Put my stuff aside, because he's communicating. I asked, he answered. So now I got to jump out there. But just, like you said, just whatever it is, over spaghetti, just those regular conversation starters. Hey, who sits at your lunch table? Are they black or white? Children know more than we think. So we're tiptoeing, and probably inside they're laughing like, just say it, just say what you want to say.
I think that's a good point. And you covered off on the first two topics of accepting responsibility and going in real and open-minded. So you led yourself right into your third topic, which is validate, because they do know, right?
Absolutely.
We like to think they don't, but they're on TikTok, they're on Mixer, if they're playing, video games, they're all over the place. And so, when we think they're not listening, they're really listening. So they have some idea. So When you go into this conversation, your third point that you made is to validate. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that process is going to work?
Right. And so one thing that I learned in therapy with children is a lot of times who they talk to is based upon who validates what they have to say, right? So you don't have to agree with it. You can even tell them, okay, that wasn't right. There are going to be consequences. But if you validate what they're saying, they're very comfortable talking to you about anything. And like I said, so that was the way I had that conversation with my 14-year-old. And after we went through the being comfortable for him, uncomfortable for me, I came back and sent him right back to that first text message. hey, I told you you were smart and intelligent. Look at your response, so just validating. I hear what you say. Again, that was not on my agenda. In my mind, I'm thinking, is this safe? How do I protect him physically in this? But that's off the table. I had to go back and remind him. Kids, like you said, kids they have access to social media. They have access to their friends that are their age, who they really believe are smarter than us as adults, right? So they've already had their conversations and added stuff. So we can't say, oh, your friends don't know what they're talking about. We have to validate. Wow, those are some interesting conversations you guys have. Let me help you understand how that ties in. Instead of just saying, that doesn't make sense. Don't listen to your friends. Don't listen to everything you see on Facebook. Don't watch Instagram. The don'ts are good, but it's now, what do I do? Because at that age, that's the norm. So we have to validate. I get it, and I hear that. But let me show you this too.
Got you. So very good point. So you know where my heart stands, where Tangi's heart stands, and a lot of other people who are educators where their heart stands. But the fourth point that you have outlined for having the conversation with children is to educate. And I think that's key. And we got into this a little bit last week about some of the flaws in the education system when it comes to how history has been written and appropriated. But there are some things in the education system that have actually prepared children better than we think, right? In this age, you can say, we can call it what we want to, but there's a certain degree of political correctness, right or wrong, but that makes its way into the education system. So from an early childhood point, kids are taught different things about being multicultural. There's multicultural nights at schools. There's activities that take place in a classroom, but that's only one piece of education, right? The kids are only at school for a little while. So when you talk about educate, I can only assume that you're talking about educating your kids at home. So can you give us some insight on that?
Absolutely. And again, I'm glad you pointed that out, because for me, I would say the first thing that you want to take away is the formal sense of educating. Because again, these are kids, we're home, we're not at school, so I don't really want to sit down and have a book lesson about what's on the news. Can we do this in more of an informal manner? So there's many ways to educate. First of all, again, with children, I have a granddaughter who's 3, and I'm pretty sure she knows how to use, the tablets and the iPads. So at this point, one of the first things you see, I have one here, is, hey, let's look up some information. Because children have access to so much, gone are the days where we can say, because I said so. They're going to look it up anyway. So if they're going to look it up, why not be a part of that process, right? Hey, let's look it up together. Another way to educate is to become familiar with your children's friends. So if you are a Black parent who has a child with white friends, or any other race, or vice versa, let me meet their mom. I'll take you over there. They're having a birthday, I'll go with you, because now we can see what that culture looks like. We can hear how they talk to each other. We can deal with what they eat that's different from us. There are so many ways, or down to shows that children choose to watch on television. Again, I have 3 boys. The hip hop today is not my favorite at all. But at the end of the day, I do have a 14-year-old son. Am I going to let him just, go overboard with what's going on? No, but he's going to listen to it. So I want to know, I want to hear who you're listening to. I want to see what you like about that lyric. Why? Because again, it brings us to a connection. So when I have to sit down and say, let's talk about George Floyd, it's not like, it's already mine. We talk about everything, right? So I've educated myself in different areas that are important to you as a child. And I think that's important, again, for that rapport, for that trust, for that ability to have these tough conversations.
Hey, Dr. McPherson, can you talk a little bit about the difference between talking with, like more of in a communal learning, and talking down or talking to? Can you talk about the difference and what maybe sentence structure would be different in those various scenarios?
Sure. I think the best statement is tell me about. To me, with parents, you know, when you're trying to get through with children, when you ask those questions, you can say, you know, how was school today? Most kids, unless they're really young, right, when they get to that next phase, it's going to be very short. But if you say, tell me about your day at school today, now you can't just say, it was okay. Tell me about it. I want to hear about it. You know, who was there? Where'd you guys sit? You know, whatever it is. Like you said, just coming to the place where I don't want you to hear my voice. I want us to have a dialogue. So that means I have to leave space to listen. I got to ask those questions and I got to be quiet. But as parents, you know, fear, trauma, different things happen that cause us to like, oh, let me just tell you, let me save you, let me show you. But sometimes we have to just kind of sit back and just hear what's going on. Because for them, it may not even be as serious as it is for us, but there's still some educating that needs to be done.
So I want to stay here on the education point for a little while. And one of the things that you call out is maybe we can talk more about this with, right? And you give the example of an older family member and or someone else who may have more insight. I'm fortunate to where both of my grandmothers are still living, high 80s, low 90s. My grandfather is still living 90 plus years old. So I have access to people who can give historical reference, who have seen things from the Great Depression through the Civil Rights era and beyond, right? You know, for as much as they can hold the conversation from their memory, that's a good step that I've seen to take. But can you talk a little bit more about how that is beneficial, whether you do or don't have access to grandparents, but you may have access to someone else?
Sure. So again, like you said, those records of history, some things you only learn through wisdom, and wisdom comes with time, right? So in order for me, everything may not be in a book, or I may not know everything just yet, but like you said, we may have our grandparents, but there's also at our church, one of the things that I did with our youth group is took them to the nursing home to adopt grandparents, right? Whether your grandparents are in your life or not. Reason being, again, many of us don't have our grandparents, but just to be able to go, to sit, to listen, to hear. And for me, one of the things that I found interesting is listening on both sides. I think having these tough conversations, one thing that I didn't point out is we want to make sure that we're educating for the purposes of educating, not educating for the purposes of our children having our same thought process or mindset, right? So I can maybe choose to be around only all Black people. That's not me, but if I choose that, that's fine. But now when I have children, I need to give them room to be who they are, which means that I need to give them access to people that can give them different sides of the story, when it happened back then, where I am now. So, you know, and of course, there are different mentors and different programs that you can also gain from, or, you know, church, there's always, you know, some older church members that you can talk to. But there's always something that was left out when you just go to school or read a book. I mean, we know there's a lot that's left out, but again, there's many ways to educate. And those stories are the ones that count. And when you listen to stories from those who are older, it's almost like they put you there, you know? So again, just wanting to gain that information so that a child can be an individual, I think is what's gonna broaden the education, if you will.
So you bring up a good point, and something I want to kind of throw out to the community that's out here, and definitely Dr. McPherson, you know, we're leaning on you to lead a lot. And, you know, Chanel, I think you're going to have some input on this. Larry, you may have some input on this, or others, right, from whoever they're on who's comfortable speaking. But when we talk about going to those older generations, specifically in scenarios where we may have a multicultural family, we have to be open and honest and admit that there's one part of the family who may not have the same view that we have. Or, if you're not from a multicultural family, you're from a white family or a non-Black family, your parents, your grandparents may not share the same view that you have because of what they experienced. So I'd be curious, and Chanel, I will kind of toss it to you if you don't mind, but I'd be curious as to how you navigate that type of situation, given your story and your background and some of the things that you've experienced.
I will say the first person that I went to get advice from was my son's father's mother and her mother. And I learned a lot from them because, I had this infant son and I was re-entering the workforce. I was in Dallas, and, Dallas is Dallas is a great place to live, but it's polarized as far as, this is usually the community Black people live in. This is usually the community white people live in. And I was working in a place where mostly white people. And I think I was the only person that had a mixed race child. So I went to them a lot for advice, and I learned a lot. I still think about everything that they told me at that time, which is a lot that I can download to you guys later, kind of what they told me and kind of what helped me through that. But as far as it goes to, I have certain family members that when I married my son's father, of course that was before my son was born. When I married him, they had some major issues. They had the issues. And so I went through that process, and then I have a son, and then I'm thinking, okay, so, I'm going to send my son every summer, except this summer's different. But every summer since he's been born, I go to my hometown for like 2 weeks to a month. When my son was about 4, I started leaving him there for like 2 weeks out of that month, and I would go back to Texas, and he would be there, and I had to, trust that the people around him would not increase any sort of trauma related to race. And that was a hard thing for me to find that trust. And it was also something that I felt like, even at a young age, because my son started spending 2 weeks in the summer without me being there when he was 3, it was extremely difficult for me to figure out how to talk to a 3-year-old about this, or do I not talk to him about it? When he was 4 and I was home for that month in the summer, we went to the lake, because my parents have a lake house, and we were at a cafe in this really small town, and my son was just running around like crazy, and some man sitting next to our table said, "Hey boy, what are you, a Mexican?" So my son looks at me, he's like, "I'm a Texan." It's saying, I know, he's a Texan. And if you've been to Texas or you're from Texas, that is something that is, I think, embedded at birth. No matter your race, that's something that is embedded in you, something to be proud of. And I'm in the background going, "Oh my God, that's who he says he is." But I also, that was a big, I don't know if it was a warning sign, but I was like, God, I really need to start talking to him about this, because if it's one thing for me to trust that I know I have family members that are not happy that my son is of mixed race, and I can try to avoid them as much as possible. But, there's family situation and holidays, which they're going to be around. So how do I prepare my child for this? So that's been an interesting journey. And, he's now 14. And so he lives in this kind of duality place where, on his dad's side of the family, it's everybody is a different color, no matter their race. That's one of the things I love about it. Every year we get our family picture done with my ex-husband's family, and it doesn't matter if, what race they are. It's a mix of everything. Every color is different. Race doesn't seem to be a major it's not a major issue in their family. They don't care, you know, what race of what spouse somebody's bringing into the family. And I've learned so much about inclusiveness and really loving people for who they are in their soul from that family. And, you know, I also know and I have a wonderful family. And I don't want to say but I also know that, you know, every summer when my son goes home, now that he's 14, he has his own phone, you know, I'm getting calls from him, you know, this person said this or this person said that. So, you know, I'm trying to, even though he's prepared now for what that looks like and how he, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, he's asking me, how do I respond? I'm like, how do you want to respond? First of all, how does it make you feel? And then we work from there. So it has been definitely interesting. And I know, you know, he just started his freshman year, started summer school a week ago. So I have him in the house for 4 more years, and, you know, he's going to do amazing things in life. And I want to ask, I have a lot of questions to ask you all about how to prep him for life, you know, out of somewhat of a controlled environment. One more thing. So I wanted to make this point before we moved on. So I live in Highland Park in Dallas, which, I don't know, I think everybody, I'm renting there. So I'll tell you that, I mean, it's kind of the top 1%, right? I moved there because the schools were good, and I couldn't afford private school, and I was really struggling do I just put him in a school that I don't think he's getting the best education, or do I move him to a super white neighborhood? So I chose to move him to a school where there was not a lot of diversity. And I had to prep him a lot. I thought I had to prep him a lot for that. And he entered that in 3rd grade. And things were great, because I think at that age, his peers aren't looking at differences in their skin at all. And it wasn't until, I mean, just last year in 8th grade, a kid behind him, well, let me back up. He's a straight A student, and he speaks Spanish because he was born into that family. And he's starting to get a C in Spanish class. And I'm extremely concerned. And he just kept saying, I don't know the class. I don't like the teacher. You know, he had all these excuses. And it took me, you know, months to get him to tell me what was happening. And there was a kid in his class who was sitting behind him, calling him the N word every single day at school. And he was the only Black kid in his class. So finding that out and knowing that had been going on for so long, and him not telling me, I mean, I think that's one thing. I have a lot of questions. I feel like I didn't prepare him as well as I had tried. I feel like I failed at preparing him for that, because he didn't feel like he could tell me. We've talked a lot since then, and I asked him, you know, why was this something that you didn't tell me about? Because I feel like him and I have a good relationship, and he has a great relationship with his father and his father's parents. I'm like, why isn't this something expressed? And, you know, I think he was 13 at the time, and he told me he was able to express that he had a lot of shame over it. He was embarrassed. He was embarrassed as a man, you know, because at that age, they start going through puberty. So we started telling him he's a man and he needs to, you know, hold himself to that level. He's like, you know, as a man, I wanted to do something about it, but I felt like I couldn't, because I thought it would get worse if I stood up for myself. And I didn't want to tell my parents, because I knew I did exactly what he was worried about, which is I called the principal, and we ended up having a conference with that child's parents, which is a whole different story. But yeah, I'm going through this process with learning as I go. And there are definitely things I think I did well, but there are things I just don't know. I never dealt with in my life. And I'm trying to figure out how to, you know, teach another human being how to deal with those things. So as much wisdom on my experiences I have to give, I have just as many questions. So.
Absolutely. So Chanel, we appreciate that, and we will definitely address those questions. And I'm sure Dr. McPherson has some insight that she could give on that too. But we had a question to come up in the forum.
Okay.
And I think it's a strong question. And so, Cedric, I think this is a good time to shift to the rubric on race and children's age. And the question came from Montoya.
A sister-in-law.
Yeah, Cedric's sister-in-law. A candid story is my son's, Chris is probably gonna kill me, but their second daughter was my son's first real girlfriend. they grew up together, like in the cradle together. So anyway, question came from Montoya, and it is: how do you communicate with children that feel like there are no color lines, like they haven't experienced bad things, so they feel like racial disparity doesn't exist? So, Cedric, if you don't mind, go ahead and put the chart into the chat so that everybody can take a look at it. But Dr. McPherson, we'd like you to kind of to walk through those things as we also look at the chart and give the clinical insight on that as well.
Sure. And so one thing that I want to say about this is, like I said, we all hit, we're all professionals in our own right, whatever different field that is. And for me, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I was there for 28 years of my life. And unfortunately, however you want to look at it, I was raised, I never experienced racism at home in Philadelphia. I always went to schools where there was a big diversity, neighborhoods, friends of all different races. It didn't matter. Here in North Carolina, I moved to because the violence was one thing in Philadelphia, but I moved here and put my then 12-year-old in school. And we talk about how do we communicate with children. I went through an experience with my son as an adult, as a at the time, maybe 40-year-old adult who had never experienced racism. So what was always taught to me by my parents was just confidence in who you are as an individual. But when a situation hit and my son was in school, he went through some things and he was being, I don't want to take up a bunch of time, but he went through a lot of things at the hands of his principal, who was a white woman. And it wasn't just him. It was things pointed out, facts that showed that she was treating Black children different than she was other children. I'll just say that. So long story, we got to the point where my son was affected by it. I was affected by it. And it drained the life out of me because as an adult, I felt like, oh my goodness, this is real. Like you hear about it, you see it on TV, but racism is real and this is my child. So how do you have that conversation? Because obviously I didn't have that conversation with mines beforehand to say, hey, be careful of, watch out for it, because it wasn't on my mind. But at that point, it helped me to understand, as we go back to the education, we want to educate children on what they need to know as far as life is concerned, the realities of it. So a lot of us do go in more of a repair mode, but because these are actual situations that exist, and I always talk about, even in the mental health field, it's the same as physical health. So we prepare our children and we can say, hey, this is what diabetes looks like. You don't want to eat too much sugar because, or you don't want to have too much salt because this is what happens and this is how cholesterol works. This is what we can talk about with our children. I have had to prepare my children for the conversation of police because they're Black boys, and I've experienced that. So you have to have those conversations, even though they may not think. We don't want to generalize it, but we want to express to them, hey, let's, again, going back to that education, let's look at some situations. Let's see why everybody's so angry about what happened with, this little Black boy. Let's see what's going on. Or do you know, some situations that your friends really feel like they shouldn't have been in trouble. Let's talk about that, but just, again, looking at those real life situations before they happen, because it does exist. And I feel like if we prepare them for it, it will cause them, because I have to be honest, for me as an adult, it took me a minute to shake myself after that happened to me a couple of years ago to say, hey, listen, you're a doctor, you know better. It's not every white person, right? But I have to be honest. I had to shake myself, like, get yourself together. You know better than this. So I think if we prepare our children and have those conversations, it doesn't have to be their personal experience. But then, God forbid, it does come up. It's like, oh, okay, this is what happens in the world, instead of, I'm lost. What do I do now?
Right. So I think that that's a good point. And always going back to education is going to be something that gives you the foundation to move forward, right? Whether it's formal education, informal education.
She's a doctor. She's a pediatrician. She's feeling the same way I'm feeling. She said the same thing I'm saying.
Okay. One of the things that we want to look at, we put a rubric out in the chat, so hopefully you guys can open it up and take a look at it. And the question that's in that rubric is, are your kids too young to talk about race? So it matches exactly to the question that Montoya was really asking. And the answer is that no, silence about race can reinforce racism by letting children draw their own conclusions. So if children are going to draw their own conclusions, it's best that we inform them as possible so that they draw educated conclusions that are rooted in the right concepts. So if we look at this chart, as early as 0 to 1 years, we know that 0 to 7 children are sponges. They absorb everything, right? So the earlier you start to address it the right way, the better. And at 0 to 1 years, all faces look the same, right? But at 3 months, babies look more faces that match the race of their caregivers. And that's because that's who they're around. So automatically, right, this child has no concept of race, but they have a concept of an image that they see, right? And they start to associate more with that image visually, and then the auditory association comes in. And that's in that first year. But by 2 years, children use race to reason about other people's behavior, right? And we have to think about that. By 2 years old, this generation of kids, they can tell you what to do on your phone. They can tell you what to do on your laptop, right? So they consume information even, as young as 2 years old. So if they're consuming digital information, they're consuming everything else around them as well. And so they're already starting to form opinions about people's behavior based on what's being fed to them. So again, another point where you've got to get in early, have these conversations, or else someone else or something else is going to educate your kids. At 2.5 years old, most children use race to choose playmates. Now let's let that sink in for a minute. 2.5 years old, a child is already choosing playmates based on the images that they processed from day one and what's around them. So what that means is that at that young age, we need to have these conversations and continue to expose our kids to multiple cultures, multiple races, so that they begin to see people for who they are. They recognize and respect the differences, but they see people for who they are. At 4 to 5 years old, expressions of racial prejudice often start to surface, and they peak at ages 4 and 5. And I'm just gonna be honest. Some of y'all know I grew up in rural East Texas, backwoods East Texas. The first time that I had a fight was the first time that I was called an N-word, and I was 5. And it really wasn't even me being called the N-word. It was another boy about 7 who wanted to get on the swing. My sister was on the swing. She didn't want to get off. He pushed my sister off of the swing into the dirt, called her N-word, a dirty N-word, and told her, get off the swing. And at 5 years old, I already knew what that meant. And I'd already been exposed to the differences between white and black in this environment. And, from what I can remember, I grabbed a handful of gravel and threw it at him and got dirt in his eyes and proceeded to take care of my sister and take care of him in the process. That's at 5 years old, right? They're already exposed to that. So for the educators, by the time they hit kindergarten, they've already got this concept. And so our education system is already having to deal with it from a disciplinary standpoint. The child shows many of the same racial attitudes held by the adults in our culture. So not just the adults in their household, but it's often said you have to guard your eye gate and your ear gate. So we have to be mindful about what we are letting our kids experience by sight and what we're letting them listen to. And if they're hearing these things and they're seeing these concepts from places other than the home, or they're being reinforced in the home, that gets back into the systemic issue that we have, right? So we're already up to 5 to 7 years old. At 7 years old, 5 to 7, if we're not having explicit conversations based on what they've already been exposed to from day 1 to 5 years old, we're already behind the curve. And so if we really want to talk about driving change, part of what we need to do is get to our own children in the golden, most impressionable years and have these true conversations. Don't wait to have these conversations. You may be scared about destroying their innocence, and you have to gauge your own child to know at what level of innocence they are and are not, and how much you want to expose them to or not. But you've got to have these conversations because they've already got formulated ideas. And if you don't, someone else or something else will expose them to the very thing that you're trying not to expose them to. And now
I have a quick question to you on that.
Yeah.
So what happens, okay, so what is your advice then for, so say it's a family that, regardless if they're white or black, have just lived in a community where there's only people that look like them in that community. So maybe they haven't talked to their child about that. What do you do if, you know, now with everything that's going on in the United States, and now we're trying to go, oh shit, I should have talked to my kid about that a long time ago. What advice is out there for parents who haven't talked to their children about this, and from a young age, regardless of what race they are? What would be the experts' advice on talking to our kids now if we haven't when they were younger?
So Doc, I'm gonna let you pick that up.
Okay, and so this is what I'll say to you. And while I was listening to Ken talk, that's what came to my mind. The only thing I can say is we can't forget that we're human beings. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of pressures that, you know, are put on us, and the weight of the world can seem to be a whole lot. But to me, the most effective thing is to just relax, because at the end of the day, we can't catch everything. We just can't, right. Whether it's about race. If we focus on catching everything about race, we're going to miss some stuff about age. If we focus on age, we're going to miss some stuff about gender. So we have to be forgiving of ourselves and understand that some things we just won't hit until it happens, because we're human beings, right? And there's no manual. That's just kind of the way it goes. And my best advice is, if you haven't hit that part again, go back to accepting responsibility. You know what? We didn't live in an area where this, you know, seemed like it was an issue. That's why I never brought it up. But now I realize it is important. I don't know everything either, you know, and that's okay. But we have to be very realistic and not focus so much on the fact that, oh God, I didn't tell them soon enough. But now that this has come to my attention, what am I going to do about it going forward? And I don't want to say, but to pull some of the pressure off of the parents, think about yourself as a child. As children, we're going, adolescents, teenagers, even early adulthood, right? We're going through this morphing phase. And I use the word morphing lightly. We're morphing into who we already are internally, right? So up until we're, you know, probably late 30s, what we're doing is we're trying to take all this information that's come from you, and everybody else, and figure out, how does this work for who I am as an individual? Why do I say that? I'm saying that to say that you can do your absolute best. You can pour in everything you have. Children are going to be children, just like we were. They're going to use their little brains, and they're going to do what they think and feel comes natural based on the information that they got from you and the information that they got from themselves, who's the smartest person in the world, right? It's not really until they become of age to make mature choices where you're going to start to see what you poured in. So go light on yourself and don't feel like if things happen, oh, I messed up somewhere. That's not always the case. Like I said, I did my best to prepare my boys for police brutality, if you will, because that's something that I experienced in my neighborhood. But guess what? They still experienced it. Life happens. That's not my fault as a mom. I did what I could, you know, and maybe somebody that didn't is fine. Life happens. We just got to pick up from where we are and make the most of it.
Absolutely. Excellent.
Absolutely. And just to give everybody kind of a reference on where we are right now, we're pretty much done with the program itself, but this is going to be just an open question and answer session. Please feel free to unmute yourself, ask questions. Dr. McPherson's just going to set up shop and kind of offer advice on any questions that you may have. So if you feel like maybe you've gotten everything that you need off of this, I think it's a good time to say we really appreciate you for joining. We hope that you got something from this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to post, Dr. McPherson has a book that she has on Amazon. So I'm going to go ahead and post that now for everyone that would like to go ahead and get that and patronize her in the best way possible. But yeah, so feel free. This is an open forum now. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have and unmute yourself. Because I think that any questions that you may have, probably there's someone else that's having the same question.
Okay, I have a question. This is Montoya. So my question is, so my children, I have a 10, 13, and 1-year-old. I have a 1-year-old son, and my 2 girls are the older ones. We were tested in, and we're in these special program schools like for the gifted, talented. How can we discuss race? Okay, so the schools are based in it's pretty much in a Hispanic neighborhood, and kids are bussed in, black, white, cream, purple, green, it doesn't matter. They're bussed in because these kids are the cream of the crop, or they're special, or they scored high in math or science or what have you. So my question is, how do we talk to them about being racially aware of things that are going on? Because my children sometimes come across as there's no difference between me and Megan Sue, but Megan Sue is saying, ew, we don't like the way your hair is, or we like your hair straight, or they're not necessarily doing anything bad like bullying them, but they are saying like, you know, why are you in orchestra? Or, you know, shouldn't you want to play sports instead of go to the library? Does that make sense?
And so your question is, how do you respond to those type things?
Yeah, so how do I respond to kind of show them like, this is still, like speak to them.
Uh-oh. Did we lose her?
I think she may have cut out. Hold on. No, you're muted.
My bad. Okay, so the question is like, you know, I bringing them up and teaching them like in building them and self-esteem and everything like that. But with all this going on, I'm trying to speak to them and they're like, you know, I'm no different than Sally.
Right.
Why is this a big issue now? And I feel like Ms. Chanel was saying, like, she has her child in a predominantly white neighborhood, and so things are different. Where my kids are in a predominantly mixed neighborhood. We live in a mixed neighborhood, but they go to school in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the kids are Hispanic unless you are bussed in to go to that school.
Right. And so I think, again, and I want you guys to hear my heart, if you will. What has brought us to this point was the racial injustices that we are seeing, right? So this is the topic right now. But again, in being a parent, we want to make sure that those conversations with our children, even like you said, if they're asking those questions, well, they don't want to play with me because, you know, or they made mention of whatever the case may be, we still have to reference back to the fact that these are actual, even though it's racism, which is the huge issue, these are character flaws. So the same way we deal with, you know, again, sexism or ageism or weight, you know, people who pick on kids, you know, children are children. So you have friends that pick on you because you're too little or too big or too short or too tall. When it gets to the core of it, you have to understand that these are character flaws when it comes to the person that is the offender, if you will, right? So we still have to teach our children how to respond to life as a person, how to be confident in who you are, and also how to be comfortable having those questions. Because like you said, I'm not used to it, but Mom, why are they saying this? That's when the real answer comes in. They're saying this because these are the type of things that we deal with. They, you know, this is what racism is. This is maybe what they may be exposed to at home or maybe not. But every person is not the same. But if you have a confidence about yourself, there's nothing that can stop you. I have to deal with racism, I have 3 Black boys, but I also tell them I don't want any excuses because Barack Obama was our president. So you have from one extreme to the other. We're going to talk about it. You're going to be educated on it, but nothing and no one can stop you from being you but you.
Great answer. Great answer. So quick time check. We try to keep this to about an hour and 20 minutes. So we got about 10 minutes left. So let's keep the questions coming and let's take all the time that we have allotted to us. I'm gonna make a quick plug again. If you check the chat, we've put some of the resources, the materials that we referenced, a link to a New York Times article that will take you to a very dynamic book as well. We're here to share tools. None of us have the answers. So we're here to get you in touch with people who can give you answers or people who can share experience and most of all share tools. So please feel free to throw out any other questions that you may have. Anyway, I think Chanel, you have some questions you wanted to go back to as well.
Yeah, so let me see here. Okay, so I have a question. And I mean, of course, this comes, I don't know how many people on the call are part of this. I think everybody, or most people in life right now as adults have friends and or people in their life of all different races. And I don't want to make this a focus over children that have parents of different races, but I do have a question. So one of the questions that relates to what has happened with George Floyd and everything that's happened since then, you know, I see my son, I mean, when I heard about what George Floyd happened, my son did not know about it. And I had like 2 days of just crying about it. And, you know, he's asking what's wrong. So I told him what happened. And I asked him not to watch the video because I know that he's, you know, I haven't allowed him to have social media except he does have Instagram. So I was like, just please don't search out that video. And me and your dad would like to really talk to you. We want to talk about it together. And then we want to sit down with you and just have a conversation about it. And if you're still interested in watching the video, we'll decide before we sit down and talk about it, whether or not that's something that we think that is okay for you to watch. We were just so worried about him just randomly seeing it on YouTube or social media. And, you know, as we're trying to explain the situation, I'm coming to the realization like, oh my God, like here my son is who has a Black dad and a white mom, and he's looking at the separation of races and feelings play out, you know, play out in a way that, you know, somebody died, and then you have the U.S. as just people in whole in conflict over this issue. I guess my question would be, in this, I know this is very specific to my situation, so I apologize. If you don't want to answer it now, we can answer it later. But how do I, I don't want my son to be afraid of people that look like him. And I don't want him to be afraid of people that look like his dad. And he's such a mix of both of us. He doesn't choose one race or the other. But how do I somehow, I don't want to soften it to him, but I just don't know how to deal with that.
And so I think the best thing for you to do, again, is to be genuine. So it's almost a beautiful thing if you look at it. We don't want to be stuck on just the pessimistic side of this, right? Because there is some optimism to it. He has a white mom and a black father, right? So he has the opportunity to firsthand experience both and literally have an opportunity to live out his life, because he's not going to get in trouble for, being the son of, and when I say in trouble, at home, he's not going to be in trouble for being, a white child, because that's who he is and you accept him for that. He's not going to be in trouble for being a black child because that's who he is and his family accepts him for that, right? So the best thing we can do to make this okay is to love them unconditionally within the home. Mm-hmm. Right? Because then that's what's going to start to help them to get through. So no matter what happens, there has to be boundaries. We can't make exceptions. And just really quickly, my oldest son, he was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at 5. His father was murdered right before he turned 4. And I went through, a rough marriage that he experienced everything. So the first thing I did as a mom was make excuses. Let's be real, right? So it's like, oh, he's very fragile. Don't yell too loud. Don't. And they're just messing with him because. But in all actuality, the most beneficial thing, remember, I went to school after that, but the most beneficial thing was to help him understand this is life. No matter what your choice is, there's a consequence. Good or bad, right? No matter what color you are, no matter what gender you are, there are consequences to your choices. So at the end of the day, now that we know that, here's what happens sometimes with Black men. But at home, you're gonna mess up. I'm still gonna love you. I'm not the one that's gonna beat you. I'm not the one that's gonna tear you down. At home, when you have that rough day and you say, I experienced racism, these are the arms that you're gonna fall into. Again, I think that's the part that we have to focus on, because that's what enables our children to deal with the inevitable. We can't control what other people do, but we can control how they learn to cope with it, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it really does. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
So in our last few minutes, I'm going to ask Larry Murray, who's on, to address a specific question. And Larry, in our last panel, talked about the intersection of social justice and spirituality. And I always want to come back to that, because Larry, one of the questions that was asked by our child that we talked about and that we've asked ourselves as adults, given the situation that we are in now with racial inequality, social injustice, the alarming rate of killing of Black and brown lives by police officers, the systemic racism that's there, we have to think, right? God is here, God has a plan, but why does God allow us to suffer through this?
In a minute?
Larry, take all the time you need, man.
Just a word, Larry.
Oh, man, that is a great question, and one that people have wrestled with for centuries. Going back to perhaps even the first chronological book of the Bible is Job. Him wrestling with suffering. Why does God allow it? And maybe just the simple answer, I hope it's not simplistic, is that we are broken people in a broken world, and God is redeeming us and saving us, but it's not going to be all perfect until there's a new heaven and a new earth. And that's why God sent his son Jesus to to be the sacrifice and to suffer for us and to take what we deserved. The ultimate injustice was that a sinless man died for me in my place and suffered. And that's part of God's plan, so that I could live with him forever and so that we could live with him forever. But this old world is broken, and it's never going to be perfect until he makes all things new. That's what Jesus knows. That's what John saw in the book of Revelation at the end, that one day it's going to be all new. Today isn't that day. Maybe it's tomorrow. But it's to point us to our need for redemption. And until then, we're going to suffer, and it's hard. I hope that isn't overly simplistic or pie in the sky. I see that as a reality of sometimes this world sucks. It's hard.
And if you guys don't mind, one thing I want to throw in there, and Pastor Larry, I'm not off the top of my head, but there's a scripture in the Bible that talks about, how struggles build character and character build faith, so yeah. If we can lean back on the fact that God has so much for us, so he has a destined place for each one of us.
Yeah.
Nothing is easy. Everything contains a process, but it's all building who we are and how we believe.
Yeah. Yeah. It builds faith. That's exactly right.
Wonderful.
So we're about out of time, but we just had a great question put into the chat. And so I'm going to open this up, and then this will be the question that we close out on. And I think it's a very appropriate question given the situation. So, Dr. McPherson, I know it's 9:20 in Charlotte, but we're going to lean on you one more time, and Larry, likely you as well. And the question is from, I don't want to mess up the first name, but the question is from someone with the last name West. And the question is, how can I help my kids cope with living between both their mixed race, Black and Native, as well as being a child of an officer? Right? Because that's something that gets overlooked in all of this. There are children of police officers, regardless of race, who are also having to face the perceptions that are now being put out about their parents. How do we address that?
There are definitely a lot of dynamics. And I know I keep going back to it, but for me, the short of it is just be as honest as you can. Let your children be as honest as they can be, as genuine as they can be. Like I shared, my husband's children are biracial. But what we do here, we're very just relaxed, so there are some things, we don't make everything so tight. There's the Black people always eating chicken and the white people food not seasoned, just using for an example. We allow those here. They have a white mom and a Black dad, So we kind of mess with each other, and we talk about what's true and what's not, what's just a joke, what stereotypes are. But we allow those opportunities for the kids to just be as natural as possible. Again, you're talking about a child of a police officer. They want to know. You have to have that conversation. You know what? Just like there are Black people who do the wrong thing, white people who do the wrong thing, there are some police officers. Again, we got to teach them. These are all character flaws. But do you know who your parent is? Do you experience that love from him? So that makes that person different from what we're seeing on the news, So it's just being as honest as you can.
Absolutely. And I think that's so critical. The theme that I keep hearing through all of this discussion is be real, be true, and be honest. Because the truth is, it sets you free. It's just like the word, it separates marrow from the bone, right? The truth is the truth, and you can never go wrong with the truth. So it's 8:23. I know some people got to get to dinner. I know some people got to get to work. So I just want to say on behalf of Cedric, and I know Cedric has put it in the chat, but I want to say on behalf of Cedric and myself, we thank you for joining. I saw a question where someone asked, will there be more? There will absolutely be more. So please spread the word. Please continue to join. If you have topics in mind that you'd like to talk about, you can email cedric@craineylaw.com, or if you know either one of us personally, shoot us a text, shoot us an email. We will definitely talk about it. You guys get another topic coming up in the next week that was a spillover from last week. You might get to hear Larry Murray talk longer than a minute, because I guarantee he will change your life if he talks longer than a minute. So we definitely appreciate you all being willing to come together with us as a community. And if you have questions and want to reach Dr. McPherson directly, she's put her email address into the Zoom chat as well. Doc, I hope you are ready to be inundated with questions because I think they will come. And again, this will be posted to YouTube. We will share the link out via social media, via text, via email. Please share it with your friends, family members, whomever. We thank you guys for joining. God bless you. Have a good night.
Good night.
God bless you, everyone. Thank you for joining. All right.